again, welcome Nord Anglia, and thank you for joining us for our MIT abstract on linking brains and machines with MIT Ph.D. student Guillermo Herrera-Arcos. I'm your host, Fatima Hussein, and I'm a Ph.D. student at MIT studying ancient Earth. Now, before we jump right in, I'd like to cue our listeners into what an abstract actually is. An abstract is just a snapshot or a summary of a greater work of research or writing, and with this series, MIT Abstracts, we're bringing abstracts of inspiring MIT experts like Guillermo straight to you. And what's even more exciting is you have the opportunity to ask our illustrious experts questions through the Q&A pod in Zoom. So now, I'd like to introduce our expert for today, Guillermo, who's going to tell us all about his cool work. Hi, Guillermo. How's it going?
Hello, Fatima. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great. How are you doing?
We are doing awesome. I'm so excited for your talk, so I'm going to let you take it away.
Amazing. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everyone organizing this. I'm very excited. My name is Guillermo Herrera-Arcos. I'm a PhD student at MIT, and I would like to talk about my research on how we're trying to link brains and machines using very different fields. So we use robotics, we use neuroscience, we use biology to try to solve really hard problems like disability. So I'm going to tell you some stories, and I hope that throughout these stories I share today, you get two main takeaways. The first one is that in the science world, currently we're exploring the possibility of linking brains and machines, so brains and robots. And I'll show you some examples where show that this is actually indeed possible. The second takeaway is that this scientific work can be translated to technology, and then this technology can be used to actually improve the lives of a lot of people. So I started working on this when I realized the profound impact that technology can have in the life of people. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. So first, a little bit about me. I was born in Mexico. So I was born in a city that's called Jalapa, which is right here, southeast of Mexico, close to the Gulf Coast of Mexico. It's a beautiful city with a beautiful downtown, lots of ups and downs, and it's really famous for its coffee. That's probably where I got in love with coffee without knowing. And here during high school, I got to learn three main things that made me realize what I wanted to study. The first one was math. So I got really interested in math, in numbers and theorems and all of these demonstrations, algebra, calculus. The second thing was computers, coding. I learned how to program a computer through code. And the third one was electronics. So I learned how to turn on and off lights, how to move some motors. But the most important realization came when I learned how I could combine all of these. So I learned how I could put, for example, a number, and then put that number and those equations into a computer, and then the computer will, for example, move a motor or turn on a light. So basically, I realized that through something really fundamental as numbers and math, I could create movement. And that was really important to me. So that's why I decided to study robotics. So then I moved to Monterrey, which is another city in Mexico. It's close to the border between Mexico and the US, here in the north. And I studied robotics engineer at Tec de Monterrey, which is a really nice university, has a nice campus. Here's a picture of the campus. And here I got the opportunity to do research at this university, as well as the University of Houston. And I got to create two companies, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. And one of the main lessons that I got while being here is that it's really important to be friends and collaborate with people that inspire you. So if I look back at my time in Monterrey, at college, one of the best things was that I was able to be friends with these people that inspire me, and that's why we got to do some really amazing projects. So now, when I was here, how did I know which projects I should work on? And I think the answer to this, it has two parts. So the first part is by trying a lot of different stuff. So I try, a lot of stuff. And the second part is by trying to be very sensitive about the impact of this project. So every time I got to try a new project, I will try to imagine what would be the impact that project could have on people. And that helped me a lot in deciding what should I do. So I tried building mobile apps for phones. I tried building cars. I tried a lot of robotic projects, but there was specifically one that made me actually decide what should I work on. So this project involved robotic exoskeletons. A robotic exoskeleton is a robot they use here in the image, the one that this person is wearing. You can think of it as a pair of pants that has motors and can help people to move. So we were doing experiments with this robot. So basically this person right here, because of a condition he has, he couldn't move his legs. So basically we strapped this robot to the person. And then because of the help of the robot, this person was able to walk. So that was a really important thing to me, because by wearing this robot, this person thought it was possible to walk again because he gave some steps and he also had hope again. And for me, it was important because that was the first time that I really understood why technology can really impact the life of others, by giving not back only the possibility to move again to someone, but also giving back the possibility to have hope again. So after this, I started working on similar projects. I continue developing these robots. So this one is a similar robot, but for a kid. So if you see, it's a bit smaller. It also has a lot of motors and electronics. And here I'm testing this robot. I basically moving the joystick that is right here, and that the robot can move the legs to help someone walk. This is how this robot looks right now. Right now, it's being used in clinical trials by a lot of children in a lot of hospitals in Mexico and other countries. And I got to make a tons of robots. So I made that one for children. We also made versions for humans. We also made for different parts of the body, like the knee. And one of the most important things about all of these projects is that all of these are open source. And what that means is that all the instructions to build them, all the materials that you need, all the code and instructions are for free online. So if you enter to this link, for example, if any of you is interested in building one of these, you can enter to this website, and then you can learn how to do that. And a really important lesson for me building this was that it was really important to share knowledge so others can build and also help. Most of the problems we're currently facing are really, really hard to solve. So we really need the help of everyone, and everyone can contribute to these problems. Another project that I got to participate was on robotic prosthesis. So just to recapitulate, an exoskeleton is a robot that goes on the limbs of someone. So if you see here, this person, he has his legs, but he needs the exoskeleton to help him move. In this case, a prosthesis replaces the limb. So this person doesn't have limbs. So that's why we put this robot, so this person can walk again with the help of these robots. So I got to work on also some of the programming to make move these robots. Another interesting project was on brain-machine interfaces. Previously, on all of these examples that I show you, another person is telling the robot what to do. So for example, in that case, I will program my computer and tell the robot what to do, tell the robot how it should move. But wouldn't it be way cooler if the person that is using the device can tell the robot what to do using its own brain signals? And that's what we're trying to do here. So an important lesson here is that the brain, our nervous system, so everything from our brain, our spinal cord, our muscles, all of that runs on electricity. So if we can actually read those electrical signals, we can actually try to understand. So that's exactly what we did. We put a bunch of sensors that, like the ones you see in this image to persons, and then we try to analyze to see if we can learn something from them. So this is an image of a lot of these signals of a lot of people. And then we use artificial intelligence algorithms. And basically what this means is we just got help from computers to try to make sense of all of this data. So with all of this, after I knew that it was possible to read information from the brain and to write information to the brain, I decided that I wanted to continue doing this type of projects. So I applied to grad school and I moved to Boston. Boston is here on the Northeast, close to Canada. It's a really beautiful city, and probably Fatima will agree with me. Sometimes it's cold, but it's really beautiful. Here's a picture of the campus. So I'm in a laboratory that's called the MIT Media Lab. This is a really, really huge laboratory with a lot of groups where people are working everything from genetic engineering to designing new screens, to designing new musical instruments, or for example, my group, which is the Biomechatronics Group, where we study biology, we studied mechanics, and we studied electronics to try to understand the human body and then design devices like the robots that I show you so we can help the human body to move. So what I'm currently exploring is this question. So with all the previous projects that I did, I asked this question: what if instead of using robots, we could control the muscles of people that have some sort of condition or disability to move again? So that's what I'm currently exploring. So you already learned that our brain and our nervous system runs on electricity, right? So I show you that if our brain has a lot of electricity, we can put sensors and we can read that information from the brain. It turns out that we can also write information to the body. So using the same principle of electricity, we can give kind of like, you can think of that as electrical shocks in a very controlled way to the muscle. So in this way, we can move some muscle with this electricity. And with this, we don't need any motors. We're using the muscle itself of the persons to recreate the movement of a limb. So I'm exploring how to do this using different type of energy, different techniques, using electrical stimulation as well as optical stimulation. So controlling these muscles with light. So basically what I do in my experiments, I do experiments with mice to study how we can control these muscles by shining light on the muscles. And in this way, we can control the muscles in a very natural way, and their muscles don't get tired. And then all of this serves to learn how we can use this technology to later apply it into humans. So in the future, someone that is not able to walk because of a condition like a spinal cord injury or because of an accident, that person will be able to walk again or move again by using the technology we're developing. So we basically envision a system where we have these simulation techniques that I show you. So basically we can read information from that, we can write information back into the muscles and make this person move. Finally, I would like to tell you a story of how we're trying to translate all of this scientific work to try to help a lot of people through a company. So Protesia is a company that I told you I started when I was doing my undergrad in Mexico. With this company, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a better way to fabricate medical devices. So there are conditions, for example, like cerebral palsy, where people have to wear devices such as the one in this picture. So because their limbs are not in the right position, they need to wear these devices so they can get rehabilitation and then can walk again. The problem is that very, very few people in the world know how to build these devices. It's very difficult and it's very expensive. So that's why even if someone is in need of this device, they cannot get it because it's very expensive. So what we're trying to do is we're using technology to help create a lot of these devices. So we're using 3D scanning. So basically by using the camera that is in our phones, so the phone that probably you already use, we're using the camera to take the shape of a human limb. So here, for example, you can see how we take that image and how it's actually a 3D image of the limb. So you can see here the ankle, the toes, the leg, everything. Then in the same phone, the doctor can prescribe the device. And then basically what we do is on a computer, we design the device for the people. And then we send that device to a 3D printer. So basically we fabricate that device. So this device is very personalized and it actually will meet the requirements that the doctor wants for the patient. So we are, this is a picture of one of these devices. These are tailor-made, these are custom-made for the people. So the fit is really, really nice. And you see here one of the children using these devices. Without these devices, this child wouldn't be able to walk. So thanks to these, they're able to walk, get their rehabilitation, and one day we'll be able to walk without these devices. Another cool thing is that all of this technology was able to help during the COVID-19 pandemic. So because we could 3D print devices, because we could 3D print materials and stuff, we helped in printing parts to make prototypes for ventilators for the hospitals. We were also able to 3D print some of the swabs that are used to make the COVID test. So I don't know if you have got one of those tests where they put you a swab into your nose on your throat to get a sample, so later they can tell you if you have or not have COVID. We were also able to, by using the same camera and by taking the shape of someone, we could take the shape of someone's face, so we can design a mask that really, really fits to that person. So you can see me here wearing one of these masks, where actually the fitting is really nice. So it really protects me from the virus, but it's also comfortable. So kind of to trying to recapitulate the two main takeaways that I want you to take is that the first one, in the science world, we're exploring the possibility of linking brains and machines. And you learn that we can both read information and write information to the brain and do very cool stuff like control muscles, for example. And the second takeaway is that science is really, really important, because this scientific work can be translated to technology, and this can be used to improve the health of people. So we can make people get affordable devices so they can walk again, or we can create devices to help in the pandemic. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Well, Guillermo, we have a lot of good questions in the chat from the Nord Anglia students. So the first one with 7 upvotes is, how do you make these exoskeleton machines like not too heavy so that people can walk better in them without the machine actually weighing them down?
Wow, that's actually a really, really big question. And actually, it's one of the questions that we're still trying to answer. So you might think that all of these, because I show you these cool devices, that all these questions are answered. But the reality is that no, we're still trying to make these devices better every day. So one of the main challenges, as you mentioned, is the weight. Our human body is already really, really efficient. So we walk already using just the right amount of energy. We walk using, just the right amount of muscles to create, like almost a perfect movement. So to recreate this movement with a machine is really, really hard. So currently, the technology is still trying to develop, so we can make, for example, all of these motors more lightweight while keeping them very powerful, because our muscles, they produce a lot of energy in a very efficient way. So to basically create the muscle artificially, to have like a synthetic version of a muscle, it's really hard. So we're still trying to develop these devices so they can be more lightweight, but also help the people.
And we have a Nord Anglia student that's wondering, I mean, do you incorporate feedback from the folks that you test these devices on? Like, would it someone who's wearing it say, okay, this is too heavy or something like that? How do you incorporate feedback in the folks that you're trying to help?
For sure, yeah. So one of the most beautiful things about research is this interaction that we have with the patients. And research is this continuous process of improving and improving a prototype, and that's why we have to do all of that work before we take it through a company to a lot of people, because it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and people have to like it. So when we do all of these experiments, first we test them without a human. So first we test them in the lab to make sure it meets all the requirements. Then we attach it to a human, and we try to be very sensitive and try to be very careful about what they have to say. And then after they wear it, during the session while they're testing the device, we ask them a lot of questions, and then we continuously change, for example, the algorithm so it can perform better. If there's something that we cannot change right away at the moment of the experiment, we will just write down all of those suggestions, and then we'll go back to the lab, do all of those changes, change the prototype, and then try again next week. And that's basically a process that we do 20, 50 times until we get a design that is actually comfortable, that we can then make a larger study, and then hopefully take it to people.
Got it. And we have, I think, a Nord Anglia student who might be interested in neuroscience, because they're asking, how do you translate brain signals into exoskeleton movement?
That's a really, really good question. So, as I told you, our brain runs on electricity. So basically, we have all of these neurons in our brain, and these neurons, when they communicate to each other through what we call a synapse, that pathway basically it generates a lot of it generates electricity. So basically, there's several ways to try to read that information. One way that I show is we put a lot of sensors on the head and we try to get those signals. Another way is try to do it a little bit more invasive. So I don't know if you've heard of Neuralink, for example, where they're actually trying to put these sensors inside the brain. So basically that will require a surgery where you open the skull of someone, you put the sensors literally on the brain. So that signal is clearer, it has less noise, so you can actually make more sense. So once we have those signals, then the question is like, how we make sense of them. So one of the things that I show you, for example, is how we use artificial intelligence algorithms or machine learning algorithms to try to actually make sense of this data. So we know, for example, if you look at a signal, it has several features or several characteristics. So one of them can be, for example, how big the signal is. So we can take, we take how big that signal is, and then we try to correlate that to a particular movement, for example, to movement of the hand. And then if that doesn't work, then we might take now the information of, how fast the signal is going through time. So then that might correlate better to what the person is trying to do. So it's basically, I guess in short, the answer is by taking characteristics of these signals and trying to correlate them to actual movements or what this person is trying to do.
Got it. And do you learn that kind of information by testing these sensors on like folks who don't necessarily have issues walking? Like, do you study this stuff in like people who don't have disabilities first and then figure out what that means and then translate that to folks who actually could wear these exoskeletons?
Yes. So one of the studies I did in undergrad was actually first trying to understand these brain signals and find a way where we could actually, get reliable signals. Because you can imagine that, we're literally trying to get brain signals. So if we do that in a non-invasive way, where we put a sensors in the head, so where we basically, don't have to put the sensor all the way to the brain, the signal has to travel a really, really long path. So it has to go from the cell, and then it has to travel through, all that tissue, then the bone, then, our hair and everything, and then our sensor reads the signal. So we really need to do a lot of processing of the signal to actually capture the brain information. So what we did was we actually put these devices in probably 300 people while they were walking in a museum. And then we said like, are we actually getting brain signals from these people? And once we figured out that we could actually get brain signals from all of these people, then now we put them in, people with some conditions to actually, try to control devices like a prosthesis or an exoskeleton.
Got it. And I think we have a North Anglia student who's wondering, what kind of sensors are these? And do you use the same one for all of your devices, or do you have different sensors for different kinds of exoskeletons?
Right. So that's also a really good question because as you learn, it's really important to take the right information. So the design of these sensors is really, really crucial, because if we don't get the information that we want, then we might be telling the device to do something that we don't want to. So these sensors are, usually are actually very different between them. So it depends a lot. For example, if you're going to put them inside the brain or inside the body, of course you have to think about, is the sensor going to do well inside the body? Like basically our body doesn't like when we put stuff that body doesn't know. So every time we put a sensor that is, artificial or synthetic, the body, what it'll, eventually will try to do is just get rid of it. So it will like activate an immune response to be like, I don't like this. So we have to think of, really tricky engineering ways to, put some biomaterials. So that's another really important field, biomaterials to coat these devices, so we can actually trick the body to say like, this is actually something that's not gonna harm you. So, like it will be good if we can leave it here. That's like an important consideration. It goes inside the body or outside the body. Another one is, for example, how long this sensor is going to last. Is it going to be for an experiment that's going to take 10 or 15 minutes, or is it going to be something that the person is going to wear for like 6 months? So all of those considerations are really important. Another one is the part of the body. Are we going to put these in the head, in the skull of someone? Are we going to put it on top of the muscles of someone? And we want to try to put it and get the information from nerve signals. So all of that matters. So in short, the answer is, yes, we have to tailor these sensors to be for, the particular application that we want them to do.
Got it. And I think we have a follow-up question from a Nord Anglia student on this. So you are taking those signals from the brain to try to induce like that kind of natural movement in these devices. Now, is there information from these devices able to go back to the brain so you can like correct in real time? Like if you're saying, okay, I'm about to walk up a staircase, how does that work?
Right. So yeah, that is also a great question. And here is there's two type of interfaces or two type of way we can control these devices. So one is when the robot or when the device is interactive with the human, but there's no direct link with the brain. So I'm going to give you an example. One way is, the person is wearing an exoskeleton. The exoskeleton detects, that maybe the person is going to trip because we have a lot of sensors on these robots. So, we have, for example, accelerometers, which can tell, how much the device is moving. We also have, like angle sensors that, can tell how much the joint of a robot is moving. So by using these signals, the robot might say like, oh, I might be falling or this person might be falling. So let me correct this. So all of that, like, computation happens in the electronics, kind of like in the synthetics, in the digital circuits of the robot. The other modality is when there's actually information going through the nervous system to the brain. So in that way, it can be that we have, as I show you, that we give, for example, electrical stimulation to the muscles. So in that way, what we can do is, for example, the robot or the person is falling. So now we electrically stimulate the muscles. So actually the muscle can correct, the position of the limb or of the exoskeleton. Another way is we have, I think that in the future, what probably, what we're actually aiming is we have like complete read and write information to the human brain. But that's, of course, it's hard and we still, need to solve a lot of challenges to get there. But if we can get information from the brain and write information to the brain, that can happen really fast. So, like you can just think that you're falling and then immediately correct that kind of like, in a millisecond way without having to interact, with your muscles or with like another device.
Got it. Okay. And we have another question from some enterprising Nord Anglia students. So one student has pointed out that they have 3D printers in their school and
Nice.
they get a certain type of material to work with it, probably some kind of plastics. And they're wondering, what sort of materials do you use in your 3D printed prostheses?
Right. So actually, that's a really, really important question because so 3D printers are great, right? They're a great prototyping tool and basically change, like all the prototyping that we could do. Like before we had to buy all these materials and the resolution we could get to fabricate something was really not that high. So when 3D printers came, actually, we could take anything we had in our computer, anything that we can design in a software and literally, like having the physical world. But of course, it has some limitation. The main one, as you were saying, is the materials. So PLA is probably the most common one. And that one is great for prototypes, but for applications with the human body, we're actually, we might require something stiffer. We don't use PLA. So we use, for example, printers from a company that's called Formlabs, which is actually here from Cambridge, came out also of the MIT Media Lab. And the material that we're using there is nylon. So it's a way stiffer material. And the picture that I showed you of these devices that these children with cerebral palsy are wearing are actually made of nylon. So this is way stiffer. And of course the machines are like they can print a higher resolution. Right now, also one of the main challenges is how we make these 3D printers cheaper, so we can fabricate a lot of these devices. But eventually, we'll get to the point where they're actually really, really cheap.
Got it. And as a follow-up to that, because you mentioned that the 3D printers you're using came out of the MIT Media Lab and then they're based in Cambridge. I mean, do you connect with any other branches of MIT for your work, or like what sort of collaborators do you have around MIT? What fields are you in?
Yeah, that's my favorite question probably. That's also probably one of my favorite things about MIT. It's like it's when people say that MIT is really a community, is like we really mean it, because there's, you know, a lot of really interesting people, and MIT make it really easy to collaborate with these people. So to give you an example, so basically our work, or what we're trying to do, our dream, is to, you know, basically understand the human body and, you know, make it move again. And that requires, as I mentioned, also the intersection of a lot of different fields. So for example, we collaborate with groups that are experts on material science. So they help us, you know, design these sensors and these, you know, devices that go inside the human body. You know, so we take their expertise, they help you, you know, in fabricating these devices, what type of biomaterials they have to, you know, be, they help us with doing some initial testing. We also collaborate, for example, with groups that are, you know, really experts in wearables. So for example, in fashion, one of the things we're actually trying to explore is, you know, how we make these devices more appealing, you know, so they don't look kind of like an external machine, but they actually look more, you know, just like, you know, our normal clothes. So we, for example, collaborate with people that are, you know, really experts in knitting, in fabrics, in yarns, you know, in all of these fibers. So we can actually integrate sensors and motors, you know, in these products. We're also collaborating with people that are working, for example, on space problems. So, you know, the human body also, when it goes to space, you know, it can have a lot of health issues. So some of the technology we're developing can actually be very useful there. So we also collaborate with people that are trying to solve these problems of, you know, how we take humans to space safely so they can stay there for, you know, long periods of time. So we're also trying to collaborate with them. So, you know, and that's just, for example, in my case, but, you know, all of my lab mates, they're also collaborating, you know, with an equally number of, you know, really exciting people at MIT.
Do you think that you'd ever need to collaborate with a geochemist, you know, little next door kind of thing? I work right across from the media lab, so please hit me up if you ever need an earth scientist's help.
For sure, I will.
So another Nord Anglia student is wondering, you focused in your slides, it showed us a lot of devices that you're making for the lower half of the body. Have you tried to work with other body parts such as arms?
Yeah, so personally, I don't have a lot of experience with upper limbs like arms, but my group is working on a lot of projects that are related to upper limbs. So, so one of our main focus is how we control these devices in a very natural way. So how we use the information from our brain and our nervous system to control these devices. So we've shown that we can, you know, control these devices in a very natural way, you know, using devices for lower limb. And now we're trying to see if we can also do the same with hand prosthesis, for example. So, you know, there's like different considerations that we have to take between two of them. You know, in the case of lower limb, you know, walking is, you know, there's like the different type of challenges. For lower limb, for example, for walking, the movements that we have to do, they might be a little bit easier in terms of, you know, like the actual movement. But it's really hard because those devices are actually taking the load and the weight of someone. And it's also, you know, really important that if these devices don't fail, because if they fail, then someone might fall, and that can, you know, be really, really risky. On the other hand, on the upper limb, for example, the movements on the hands are, you know, are more complex. You know, the dexterity that we need to have to, you know, for example, grab something, and, you know, actually the force, you know, to actually grab it, to open it, that's really, really complex in terms of, like, you know, like brain signals. So that's harder, but also, you know, the forces are smaller. You know, if the hand fails, you know, to you know, grab, you know, a water bottle, you know, a bottle of water, you know, that's not like a big issue. So it both has, you know, its own challenges. That's why we're trying to focus on, you know, like the fundamentals of how to control these devices, and we think that this can extend to, you know, like any type of devices, both lower limb and upper limb.
Got it. Now we have a question from Lola, and Lola's wondering, can you walk us through which programs you studied at each of the schools you've attended?
For sure. That's a great question, Lola. Thanks for that question. So I did high school in Mexico, where as I told you, I got very interested in math. And then I did, for my undergrad, I studied robotics engineering at Tec de Monterrey, which is also a great university in Mexico, where I got to spend time with really, really smart people. And that's where I started doing research. That's where I, like my first experiences with developing technology that could, impact someone's life. And I was like, okay, that's probably what I want to do for the rest of my life. And then because I knew there were still a lot of challenges and, more science to be developed, that's why I continue my studies. And now as a PhD student, I'm doing a PhD at MIT. And then, who knows what I'm gonna do next, but hopefully I'm gonna, still be working on cool projects.
Definitely. And now we have a follow-up question about that, because you mentioned, you met these inspiring people during your studies. And we have a Norte Inglés student who's wondering, how do you build friendships with the people that inspire you?
That's a really good question. So I think the easiest is by, trying to be very like genuine with your interests. So, like try to be very open about what are your interests. If you like biology, if you like, sports, if you like, whatever you like, just, try to be open and tell people about it and get excited about it. So in my case, that's what, was actually really helpful. Just by, like talking to people and then realizing that we're both excited, like really excited by the same stuff, like, for example, robotics, or by, like trying to help people with technology or, disabilities. That's where actually, there was like a really important synergy. And after that, the friendship came, like once we started like actually, working on important stuff, then, eventually we became friends. So yeah, I will tell just, like try to be, try to like a lot of stuff and try to, talk about them, read about them, and just be, generally interested in them.
And now we have a question from a Norte Inglés student about the future. They're wondering first, how do you get your ideas? How do you generate ideas for new devices? And what sort of things would you like to make in the future?
Wow, that's a great question. So for the process to think about ideas, I think in order to understand the future, at least for me, one of the things that I find really useful is actually to try to study the past, because in the past, in history, there's actually a lot of learnings about what people have built, why some stuff might have failed, or on the contrary, why some stuff might actually be very successful. So there's really cool stories about, for example, how we started using the internet, or why there was a point where someone thought that the internet wasn't going to work, and then it actually worked. Or like with the cell phone, there's like similarities. Or with the industrial revolution, there are like all of these similarities. So one, I try to read from all of these like past events to try to kind of like to understand what they went, and like what was kind of like their thought process to design a device or a machine or something. Another thing to realize is that those conditions in the past might not be the case for what we're living right now. So that the same thing that worked in the past might not work right now. But I think kind of like some of those like design principles might help. So that's what I try to do. And another, so trying to also answer the question to another side, one thing that for me is also being very helpful is just trying to be very sensitive and try to be very try to understand people. So once that's a quality that requires some work. But if you can actually understand what is the thing that someone needs, or what is like a device or a technology that might help someone, to like actually be interested in that and try to help that person, that can actually tell you a lot of stuff about like why we don't have, for example, affordable medical devices right now. So that's also what I try to do. I try to talk to people that might be benefited from these devices. Yeah, so basically those two things. And I think there was another part of the question, or did I answer?
I think you answered it. It was more like, what are your hopes for the future? Like, what are some things you'd like to make that you haven't worked on already?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like actual like devices or technical stuff, one of the things I'm really excited is when we can actually like as I was saying, technology is getting really, really better. So a lot of our sensors and stimulators and a lot of the devices are actually getting really good and really small. So one of the things I'm really excited is when we can actually put all of this sensing technology inside a human body, we could really understand what's happening inside it. So, like right now we know just the surface of almost, like everything of the human body. There's like, literally trillions of cells. A lot of, processes happen inside our body, and we just, know like a couple of them. We literally don't know nothing. And that's because we cannot get information and actually, like probe information from the human body. So that's one of the things I'm really excited. Another one is I'm excited about how to integrate all of this technology kind of like in a seamless way. I think the future will be where, we actually have, sensors in our clothes, for example, or even in our underwear, like when you put your underwear, like it can tell you, like how are you doing in terms of health, if you're going to get, a disease in the coming years. So that's kind of like, that seamless integration with our, like daily devices. That's another thing I'm also really excited.
Wow, that sounds super cool. So, I mean, I think you've inspired a lot of folks to work on similar questions and research goals as you. So I think we have some future roboticists and engineers and even computer programmers. What do you think are good qualities that successful folks in these fields have? Could you leave us with some parting wisdom?
Sure. Yeah, and I hope we get a lot of biologists and roboticists working on these problems because they're actually really, really hard, and we could definitely use a lot of help. So I think there's probably, and like I hope I kind of like illustrate that with my slides, but there are like two main kind of like fields that I think are important to to be good at kind of like at this intersection. So one is really try to understand the biology of humans. So that's really, really important. As I was saying, we have trillions of cells. Inside cells we have a lot of genes. So there's like a lot of components, and then we have biomolecules and a lot of things that are happening inside our body that we don't understand. So by understanding all of these processes and all of these pathways and how our body works, that's really exciting area. So trying to understand the biology, and then that's one side. On the other side is we need to develop technological tools so we can actually interface with the human body. So I show you, for example, robotic devices that interface with the human body. But like that's just like one kind of like area. There's we can also design devices that go inside the body. We can also design devices that take information, or devices that actually modify for example, the genetic code. That will be something that's kind of like another area of the study, but kind of like has implications. If we can change the genetic code of some cells in an organ, that might be enough to correct like a condition. So we might not need a robot or like a really expensive medical tool. So we need to also learn in this technological space to develop tools, and then you just have to get interested in how to combine them. And there's like tons of issues and problems where like the right intersection between understanding and kind of like using technological tools to try to correct some condition might help. So there's conditions in the brain, there's the immune system, which is really complex and really hard. There's the heart, there's a lot of cardiovascular diseases that are probably one of the number one reason why people die. So there's like really, really a lot of problems where these functional fields can help.
Got it. Okay, so there's no shortage of problems for these folks to work on and hopefully revolutionize in the future.
For sure.
And now, Guillermo, I wish I could keep asking you questions. We have so many more good questions from Nord Anglia students, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. And before I let everyone go, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the MIT Nord Anglia Education Collaboration, for making MIT Abstracts and this super fun series possible. And lastly, most importantly, I'd like to thank Guillermo for sharing your time with us today. It has been a total pleasure to have you, and I am super inspired. Thank you so much, Guillermo.
Thank you so much, Fatima. Thank you everyone for organizing this. It was really, really fun. And thank everyone for listening to me. And I hope there's a bunch of roboticists and people interested in this stuff.
For sure, for sure. Well, thank you again. We hope to see you all next time for our next edition of MIT Abstracts.